listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. I'm Dr. Nii-Quartelai, and really delighted to welcome my next guest, Jason Reynolds, promoting his new book, Soundtrack. It's a raw, resonant, coming-of-age story about early 2000s New York City's teens whose talent and love for music lift them to unexpected heights. If you are looking for a listening experience, it's going to lift you up. We all need many stories as possible are going to lift us up in a time like this. This is one of them. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for being here, and thank you for this work. Talk to us about the origin story of your latest project.
Yeah, I was living in New York City, and there are a lot of things about this. I mean, I lived in New York City in the early 2000s, and there's a lot of things about New York City that we know, things we pay attention to, things we see and come in contact with every day, things that become normal that I would argue are not necessarily abnormal, but that are extraordinary and that are phenomenal. If we were to sort of like really, really focus in on some of it, we walk past it all. Most of the time, it's just noise and sound and the New York City madness of it all. But back in those days when I was living in New York, it's really difficult to escape the fact that there's so much talent that works underground. And the term underground, we use it usually to talk about purity, right? Especially as it pertains to arts, whether it be music or painting or film, right? Like the term underground is usually used as something that is guerrilla style, pure and raw. But the truth is that there's also a physical nature of being underground in New York City and being talented and being creative. And I wanted to figure out how to tell a story about these kids I would see on the trains playing their music and trying their best to put together their own symphonic masterpieces in their own ways, up against the soundtrack of the actual city happening around them.
I mean, that sounds really extraordinary. And when I think of the early 2000s as somebody who was a teenager in the early 2000s, not in New York, in California, I think about a lot of things. I think a lot of things that were happening in the culture, a lot of things that were happening in music and politics that sort of shaped our generation. Talk to us about how any of those things sort of helped to shape the contours of this story and some of the characters on the page.
I mean, look, in the early 2000s, if we're thinking back, this is such a good question, because if we're thinking back to sort of what was going on, politically, there's lots of things happening. Obviously, you have, if we're going at the beginning of the millennium, we have to deal with 9/11, and you have to deal with George W. Bush. You have to deal with sort of the politics of that particular time, and how everybody was feeling the change in. It's funny, we were just having this conversation earlier. The change in security, the idea that now we will live in a place that will be governed differently, and then a little further up, you start to see the ingenue Barack Obama come into play. But in between these things, you see a boon in technology. So we're also dealing with the beginnings of what we now know as social media. We have the first smartphone that is happening during the same time. We have YouTube is happening during the same time, right? This idea that there are multiple ways to engage with media, multiple ways to communicate. All of this is happening around the time in which these kids are forming this band, which some might argue would be counterintuitive, right? Technology is happening, but it's still a new thing. And so the idea that these kids still want to play in a band and go on tour, it might seem so strange in today's time, given all the technology that we have. But the truth is technology hadn't quite sunk its claws in as it has now, right? The technologies that we use, mobile technology, YouTube, and things of that nature. But you do get to see some of it there because it's this access, this information bank that they get to be inspired by so that they can then go outside and do the thing. My fear today is that we won't go outside and do the thing anymore, right? But at this particular time, technology was pushing us to try things. It was opening up information and inspiration, especially as a response to some of the other things happening politically.
I mean, it's interesting. Just as you were sharing that, I was just sort of thinking about that tension that those of us that grew up in the early 2000s as teenagers, that tension between sort of the analog world and the digital world, right? And the fact that now there are young people that only know the digital world.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we won't really know what that means for another 20 years, right? But there will be something for us to consider as it pertains to interest, right? Being connected to effort. My biggest fear around a digital generation isn't that they won't necessarily be able to think. It's not that. It's that because everything has been made readily available, because a few clicks on a phone or a computer will get you any of the information that at least you think it gets you any of the information that you need, then you rob yourself of the gift of effort, right? The gift of effort, right? To be a great musician, one has to be effortful. To be a great anything, one has to be effortful. It doesn't matter that you can get the answer if you don't know how to get to the answer, because it's the effort of process that makes one great, and not just great, by the way. It also makes one interesting. It's funny. I talk to like my OGs and everybody about this all the time about like, man, what's the generation? What's your biggest fear about the generations that are going to be digital generations? And I'm like, my biggest fear isn't that they won't be okay. I think they'll be okay. My biggest fear is that they won't be interesting. That scares me, right? More than anything, that they won't be interesting, because to be interesting, you have to be interested, and to be interested, one has to be effortful. You know.
That's a whole word right there. For a lot of our leaders, learners, and listeners that are tapped in, I think you sort of put your finger on the nose of something right there. And this isn't the first time you put your finger on the nose when it comes to young adults. We know that you are a best-selling and award-winning young adult book writer. Talk to us about why you decided to concentrate on writing books for young adults.
As opposed to?
As opposed to those, as opposed to the OGs.
Listen, I think that ultimately we 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 know where the stakes are highest, right? Like you and I both know that the stakes are highest when it comes to young people. Now, I have an awful lot of respect for the OGs, and I believe that when it comes to every other form of service in this country, we should be taking very good care of our elders. I have an elder that I take care of, right? So I'm not poo-pooing that. I'm saying that in order for there to be more elders, one has to pay in, right? We have to sort of pay into the youth in order for there to be more. In order for the idea of the elder to continue to exist, one has to pay into the youth. And I think for me, it feels useful to write in this way. It feels serviceful, um, and it feels purposeful, right? Without it being didactic or browbeating. I'm not interested in always teaching anything to young people, by the way. I'm just interested in making sure that there's some sort of mirror held up. There's some sort of representation, some sort of narrative around their lives that counterbalance the narrative of technology and film and media. Look, you were a teenager in the early aughts. I mean, the early 2000s. I was a teenager in the 90s. And I think you probably caught the last little bit where we had tons of black film. We had lots of black television, right? And there were all these images, diverse and versatile images, right? A polylithic example of who we were, that we were all the things that were beautiful and the things that were ugly simultaneously, that we could be presented that and say that, like, okay, I can be all of these things at the same time. My feet and the music, by the way, right? It was also in the music. We had all these variations of what it meant to be a black musician, and what black music was, which is broad and vast. And then there are changes, right? Technology changes things. It sometimes whittles things down. Sometimes it makes things big. A lot of times it makes things really, really small. And so in today's time, I'm not sure that young people are getting a balanced version, especially young black children are getting a balanced version of who they are represented in the media, right? They don't have it as much in the music as they did when we were younger. They don't have it as much in film and television, if at all, right? As we did when we were younger. And so now it's time for us to rely on the book. The book can do it.
One of the things that you do pretty consistently in your work is, there's sort of an understanding on the page that kids are complicated people. Is that true?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, kids are complicated people because kids are people, right? My acknowledgement is only that kids are human beings. It isn't, and that human beings innately are complex, right? Innately. I think we're always trying to simplify that, which is innately complex, and it's pointless. It's futile. Human beings will always be complex, and I think to deny children of complexity is to deny them of their humanity. So the stories that I'm making, I'm trying my best to show young people as layered, right? That yes, you could be the smartest kid in class, and you could also come from a really tough family. And that tough family doesn't have to only be tough in a way that is traumatizing, but it could be tough in a way that might be militaristic because a parent may have been traumatized, right? Which then allows me the opportunity to humanize the parents in the story, which then allows me the opportunity for the young person to humanize the parent, and the parent to humanize the young person, and then the reader gets to humanize all parties involved. I think that this is the most valuable way to communicate stories because to me it feels the most honest. To use people as symbols, I think, is a grave disservice. To say that this young person represents something is a grave disservice. That's not my job. My job is to say this young person is a person. And therefore, all of these things have to exist in order for this young person's personhood to ring true. It just feels normal for me. I mean, people talk about this, and I'm always like, man, I just want to make sure they're represented as human beings. That's it.
Mm. You just want to make sure that we register their humanity.
That's it, man. That's it. I think we spend so much time trying to give them what we deem to be parts of themselves, right? We're giving them parts of themselves, right? Because we're saying we're building human beings and we're building you into whoever it is you're supposed to be a productive citizen in society, so forth and so on, all of which I don't disagree with. But I think one can't give a young person something without acknowledging what they already have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and just as you say that, I'm thinking about a conversation I had with another brilliant Black author, Darnell Lamont Walker,
Mm.
who is author of the book Never Can Say Goodbye. He's known on these internet streets as the death doula, and some conversations just kind of linger with you, and
Yeah.
that was certainly one of them. And I've been thinking a lot about grief and how grief sort of shows up in our lives, how it shows up in our lives sometimes at a very early age, right? When we don't necessarily have language,
Mm.
or we don't have the tools to be able to process it or process it in a healthy way. Talk to us about whether or not grief shows up in some of the stories you write, and if so, how does it show up?
Grief is always there, and I it's funny because when you're writing as a Black person, when you're a Black person in literature and uh you have access and you've been given the opportunity to tell stories on a large scale, the conversation gets complicated sometimes because when you include grief in your stories, there are those of us who believe that there are too many stories that are grief stricken, right? That they're or that are fraught with grief. There are too many, you hear it all the time about like trauma porn and like, you know, are we twisting a knife into our own backs in certain ways for capitalism, like to make money, right? We hear these stories all the time. I mean, I'm sure you've heard these arguments. And I actually think that they're arguments worth wrestling with. What I also think is that not everything that is hard is traumatizing. And I don't see myself as a person who has had hard times as a traumatized man.
Mm.
I think that there are traumatic things that happen, right? I'm not saying that that's not a thing. I'm saying that it's not always the only thing that happens whenever life gets dark. And I would argue that the majority of us, no matter how shiny and intelligent we are coping, right? All of us are carrying something. My brother, you know this. All of us are carrying something. Everybody is grieving something. We are always at a surplus and always at a loss. That is the human condition, right? And so for me, why should that be any different for a child? The child could be grieving the loss of a family member. The child could be grieving the loss of a pet. The child could be grieving the loss of a neighborhood that they now have had to move out of because daddy got a new job. A child could be grieving the loss of a toy because big bro has taken it and broken it or whatever, right? Like there are lots of things that we are coping with, right? Loss is a part of our lives from very early on. Now, are there heavier versions of this and bigger versions? Of course. And I want to show all of that, but I want to show it in a way to allow the reader and all of us who are reading it, adults and young people, to see that our kids are resilient. You see it with babies, right? Babies born. I remember when my godchildren were born, or when even when my little brother was born, how doctors move children, like how doctors move infants around, right? The way that a doctor sort of is moving an infant. If you don't know better, you would say this has to be abusive, right? And the doctor is like, no, this child, like this infant child, is resilient. This is not affecting them in any way. It looks terrible, but this baby can handle the movements in which I'm sort of doing, right? They can handle me moving the limbs around in this way. They can handle these pats on the back, right? Because I need the child to sort of burp or cough up whatever might be in the child's lungs. They can handle me putting my finger in the child's mouth, and the child can handle these things. And I think that idea is something that we should carry with us. These babies can carry more than we think. Now, it's our job to make sure they don't have to carry more than they need to. But if you don't think that a child can hold in one hand the loss of a pet and in the other hand Jonathan's birthday party, then you're sorely mistaken about children.
I mean, one of the things that we hear so often in the culture is, a child needs to stay in a child's place.
Oh man.
And it seems to me that, your philosophy around engaging children as people really flies in the face of that.
I mean, I listen, the old school, look, man, I had a really progressive, strange hippie mom. And so I didn't get that in the way that my cousins did, and where a child stays in a child's place. And so because I didn't get it that way, the way I see it is, if a child stays in a child's place, and it is up to me to decide what that child's place is, I have to make a place for that child. Right. I then have to, right. Because to say that is to say that you have designated a space or a place for that child, which means that I get to decide, well, I could make new places for that child to then exist. And that's on me. And so what if I were to say, like my mother did in our household, well, then if a child stays in a child's place, then let's make that place a little bigger. Right. Let's open it up a little bit and say that in this particular place, that child has a seat at the table. That child also has a microphone, right? And gets to sort of express themselves. And that is a child's place. Now, we learn respect in our household, but it doesn't mean that you don't get to communicate your feelings. That can also be within the place that I'm making for you, right? That a child gets to emote and have feelings, that a young boy gets to cry. I'm making that place for you, right? That a child has to do well in school, but that I would not allow the grades that child receives to be attached to their identity, right? That I would teach greatness and excellence without allowing a child to feel shame for their shortcomings. I can make that place for you, right? These are all the things. And so if it is true that a child should stay in a child's place, perhaps we should then edit the place.
You are listening to and streaming A More Perfect Union on KBLA Talk 1580. We're going to have to leave that there. My thanks to Jason Reynolds, MacArthur genius, author of the new audiobook soundtrack. Be sure to download that. What an incredible talent. For more of my conversation with Jason Reynolds,